But for the rest of the world, we're going to have things done by Friday. And Friday is not that far away, so you should expect, we said, August 1st is the date that we're setting all these rates, and they are off to the races after that.
President Trump's trade ultimatum is approaching as August 1st draws near. Countries that are unable to achieve a trade agreement with the United States by this deadline risk tariffs, ranging from 15% to as much as 50% under his deal or tariff plan. Having previously inked agreements with the European Union and Japan, Trump is asserting momentum for the Union. Canada and China, two of the largest nations, are still clinging to their positions. Trade mechanics are no longer the only factor in this. It's a worldwide stress test of Trump's power and other people's readiness to follow his schedule. U.S.-China discussions failing. U.S. and Chinese officials left the table without signing a deal after 2 days of talks in Stockholm. The U.S. side made it clear that Trump still has the last say and has not yet signed off on the tariff truce, even as Chinese officials announced a 90-day extension. In the middle of the American demands were made in the talks that China cut back on its industrial overcapacity in steel and electric vehicles, cease sending $15 billion worth of dual-use technologies to Russia, and reduce its purchases of Iranian oil, which still makes up 90% of Iran's sanctioned exports. The primary concession made by China was symbolic. There were no legally binding obligations or structural reforms, but it did agree to begin exporting rare earth magnets needed in U.S. defense and technology manufacturing. Rather, China purposefully maintained the conversation. It didn't fold, but it didn't leave either. Here, time works in Beijing's favor. Although Trump started the clock, the halt feels more like a delay tactic than a move toward resolution because there is still no signed agreement. The two biggest economies in the world are still at a strategic standstill. Therefore, I believe that we should remember where we would have been on August 1st. At 30%, we would have been, and dropping to the 15% today would have been far more challenging. The European Union followed a different course when the U.S.-China negotiations stalled. A few days prior, the EU and the U.S. struck a comprehensive trade agreement, committing to hundreds of billions of dollars in new U.S.-based investment and buying American energy. They avoided additional industry export levies in exchange. The agreement was characterized by European officials as a risk management strategy. Strategic alignment was not at issue. The goal was to prevent harm. The view was cautious from Brussels to Berlin. This agreement was reached under duress to avoid the prospect of 30% to 50% tariffs that were scheduled to go into effect on August 1st, not because of shared long-term objectives. Trump hailed it as a victory. The EU's quick accord, however, merely widened a rift among partners on how to react to U.S. pressure. In comparison, Canada has adopted a very different position. According to Prime Minister Mark Carney, no deal will be done unless it will actually benefit Canada in the long run. Trump has stated that he will enforce a beginning on August 1st. All Canadian imports not covered by the current USMCA will be subject to a 35% tariff. Washington continues to hold talks, but tensions are still high. Trump himself has come across as gloomy, implying that Canada may wind up simply footing the bill. Carney's administration hasn't blinkered, though. Canadian negotiators are holding the position despite increasing pressure. They refuse to make rash concessions to purchase time, in contrast to the EU. There is more to this than trading. It conveys political ideas like sovereignty and discussion on an equal basis. Trump's approach to trade agreements, in my opinion, are going really nicely. They're really beneficial for the United States, hopefully for everyone. Trump's approach is based on using economic pressure to compel quick decisions. It worked with a few, but not all, nations. Given the opposition from China and Canada, it is evident that Trump's power is limited. Allies are splitting apart rather than responding as one. Others dive in, while others hurry to sign. Results are no longer guaranteed under Trump's maximum pressure strategy. August 1st is quickly coming, and Trump may soon discover that not all nations operate on their own schedules and that not all agreements can be compelled to be made. U.S. and Chinese officials are in Sweden for a new round of negotiations that may see them prolong the trade date past the mid-next month deadline. Third, discussions between China's Vice Premier and Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, will be in Stockholm for the next few hours. U.S.-China trade discussions. Donald Trump is now targeting China after reaching an agreement with the European Union. U.S. and Chinese officials are meeting in Sweden this week with the goal of extending their precarious tariff ceasefire prior to its expiration on August 12th. The stakes are high, but the discussions are low-key. Additionally, the battlefield is completely different this time. Both sides make strong demands during the Stockholm negotiations. Washington wants Beijing to pledge to reduce imports and open its banking and investment sectors of Iranian and Russian oil and purchase more American food and energy. Trump's administration might provide selective relief in exchange, easing export regulations on semiconductor equipment and aerospace components, and perhaps reducing some visa requirements. China isn't going in weak, though. The cards for rare earth materials are still in its possession, vital to U.S. defense and technology production. Although businesses like MP Materials are working to increase domestic production, David Riedel and other analysts note that significant alternatives won't be available for years. Beijing is able to exploit that leverage and probably will. More significantly, the current tariff's 90-day effects the tariff truce will end on August 12th. In the absence of an agreement, 55% tariffs on Chinese goods may be reinstated, or even the prior 145% threshold that had been set in preceding escalation rounds. That possibility hangs over the discussions. Current tariffs are already having an impact. U.S. merchants have burned through inventory purchased prior to or during short-term tariff pauses, claims market expert David Reilly. The cost is now reaching shop shelves as the holiday season draws near, with new shipments priced below 55% tariffs. American consumers may be squeezed if Sweden doesn't make any headway. In actual figures, not in theory. Electronics, clothing, and toys will probably all cost more in the future. Additionally, in contrast to previous years, businesses are less willing or able to cover the expenses. The pressure is brought home by this. Trump requires an obvious win, but one that, months before significant political milestones, doesn't provoke resentment from people who are looking at growing prices. To be honest, I believe Beijing's position is becoming more rigid. With Zelensky's dress down in the Oval Office, they witnessed how the administration treated our allies, including Canada and Ukraine. Beijing will never place Xi in a situation where he would seem foolish. But a deal won't be simple. China's stance, a deal won't come easy, is moving toward control rather than compromise. Beijing officials have been observing Washington's treatment of its allies, particularly the widely reported humiliation of Ukrainian President Zelensky by the Oval Office. They are resolute to avoid making President Xi seem weak. Any agreement will therefore be strictly scripted. According to reports, as a condition for continuing negotiations, Chinese negotiators are asking the Trump administration to stop from making disparaging remarks in public, a sort of communication ceasefire. Meanwhile, Beijing is boosting technological independence, particularly homegrown chip manufacturing, to lessen vulnerability in the future. The basic issues of trust, enforcement, and long-term structural change are still unresolved, even though Trump could yet be able to claim progress and prevent a tariff rise with a headline accord. And Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada is using strategic patience to navigate a volatile situation. Ottawa isn't in a rush to sign a terrible deal. Even if the U.S. has set an average tariff of 25% and threatens to raise it to 35% if negotiations fail. Canada is choosing not to exchange long-term economic autonomy for short-term gains, in contrast to some of its allies. Relief. Rather than giving in to pressure, Carney is gaining leverage as he gets ready for the USMCA 2026 review. The pace of Trump's trade strategy is quick. The EU has been signed. Canada is awaiting. Now, Sweden is the center of attention. What occurs among these U.S., although the core issues may not be resolved, the China discussions will set the tone for the future, not only in tariffs, but also in the way that commerce is used to exert global dominance. The table is becoming less full, as you may know. I was raised in Canada, where doing business with the United States is the foundation of the entire trade system. Diversifying its own trade partnerships is something Canada is actively working to do. At the moment, it is working to complete a free trade agreement with a group of South Asian nations. When President Trump discusses trade, he emphasizes strength and the use of tariffs to persuade others to engage. However, something out of the ordinary is taking place as the summer of 2025 progresses. The table is becoming less full. In a technical sense, the negotiations are still ongoing. Canada is engaged in negotiations. The EU hasn't abandoned the issue. Mexico is communicating. However, don't be misled by the press conferences, and America's closest allies are retreating in official letters. Furthermore, Trump's tariff policy is causing more than just strained international ties. It's also having a significant domestic impact on the U.S. economy. This is the largest trading partner of the United States. Similar actions are being taken by other nations. 30% on exports from the EU and Mexico, 50% on copper, medications, and other sensitive commodities, and tariffs on Canadian goods. The retaliation was calculated. Canada expedited its agreements with South Asia. Despite delaying its remedies, the EU developed a large list of retaliatory measures worth $72 billion. Mexico carried on with negotiations, but with less hope. None of these nations closed their doors, but none of them still saw the U.S. as a trustworthy ally. America is no longer at the forefront of their ambitions. Instead, they're focusing on long-term options. The last 3 months, the tariffs went into effect 3 months ago, and businesses either choose to absorb some of the cost, stock up before the deadline, or begin passing some of the cost along to customers. The true suffering started to manifest within the U.S. economy as allies discreetly withdrew. The 50% tax on copper sparked worries right away. More than half of the refined copper that the U.S. imports comes from allies like Chile, Peru, and Canada. However, domestic refinery capacity is constrained. Tariffs did not improve supply. They just increased costs. It was the Brazilian coffee is the same. Prices increased when a 50% duty was imposed. However, Hawaii is the only U.S. state where coffee is grown on a large basis. It's just not practical to import alternatives. The expenditure was borne by American consumers with no benefit in strategic safety. U.S. financial institutions and businesses, meanwhile, started paying close attention to the impact. Many companies either front-loaded inventories, tried to absorb the higher costs, or pass prices on to customers, according to CBS News investigation. Household spending was also examined. Banks were keeping an eye on whether American consumers, who were already feeling the effects of inflation, were making less purchases or falling behind on their payments. Investment was another topic examined by beyond immediate inflation. Rising input costs caused business mergers and initial public offerings, IPOs, to stagnate. And uncertainty in trade. These events prompted concerns about confidence in the trajectory of the economy, as well as present earnings. Additionally, commentators pointed out that the White House was now pursuing monetary policy changes as President Trump persisted in openly pressuring the Federal Reserve to reduce interest rates. The EU has hinted that U.S. services, intellectual property, digital platforms, and financial products may be the focus of its upcoming round of retaliation. These are regions where the U.S. has historically had excess. The U.S. loses influence as well as revenue if that excess erodes. In the meantime, Canada is examining export authorizations for important minerals such as uranium, copper, and rare earths. Restricting shipments to the U.S. would cause supply chains for AI and EVs to break down. Chips as well as clean technology production. A complete trade breakdown with Canada and the EU could lower U.S. GDP by as much as 0.4%.